I came home on a Tuesday expecting nothing more than a quiet dinner and maybe watering the tomatoes, and instead, I found a 6-foot privacy fence cutting straight through my backyard like it had always belonged there. Clean line, fresh posts, still smelling like treated lumber. Except it didn't belong there, not even close. It sliced across the corner of my garden bed, clipped the edge of my sprinkler system, and this is the part that made my stomach drop. It sat well past where my property line was supposed to be. Now, I'm not one of those people who freaks out over every little thing. I'm pretty easygoing. I mind my business. I pay my dues. I wave at neighbors. But I also know exactly where my land ends because when I bought the house back in 2019 in what we'll call Cedar Ridge Estates, I paid for a full survey, not because I'm paranoid, but because I've heard enough HOA horror stories to know better. And standing there in my backyard, staring at that fence, I had this weird moment where my brain tried to rationalize it, like maybe I was remembering wrong. Maybe the line wasn't where I thought it was. But then I looked at the metal survey pin near the corner of my lot, still there, untouched, and the fence was clearly, undeniably inside it. Not on the line inside it. About 14 inches, give or take. Which doesn't sound like much until you realize it ran the entire length of my yard. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the HOA president. Now, the president at the time was this guy. Let's call him Greg Hollis. Mid-50s, always walking around like he owned the place. The kind of guy who says things slowly not because he's thoughtful, but because he assumes everyone else is slower than him. He picks up. I keep my tone calm, because I'm not trying to escalate anything yet. And I say, "Hey Greg, quick question. There's a fence in my backyard that definitely wasn't there this morning, and it looks like it's on my property." And he doesn't even pause. Our contractor measured it. It's correct. Just like that. Flat. Final. No curiosity. No concern. No, let me check on that. Just dismissal. I actually laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. And I said, "Well, I have a survey that says otherwise. Can you send me the measurements your contractor used?" And that's where the tone shifted. "Look," he says a little sharper now, "we're enclosing the common area properly. The placement is where it needs to be. You're mistaken. You're mistaken." I remember just standing there in my kitchen, phone to my ear, staring out at this fence like it had personally insulted me. I said, "Greg, I'm not trying to make this a big deal, but that structure is sitting on my land. I'd like to see the measurements." And he goes quiet for a second. Not the kind of silence where someone's thinking, but the kind where they've already decided the conversation is over. Then he says, "Just let it go," and hangs up. Just hangs up. Now at that point, I had two choices. I could either ignore it and hope it somehow resolved itself, or I could start documenting everything like my future sanity depended on it. I chose the second one. Over the next few days, I took photos, I pulled out my closing documents, I double-checked the survey, I even measured from the pin myself just to make sure I wasn't losing it. And every single time, same result, that fence was in my yard. So I sent a formal email to the HOA board, polite, professional, nothing aggressive, asking them to review the placement and, ideally, commission an independent survey before things went any further. No response. A week passes, nothing. So I send another one. Still nothing. And that's when it started to feel intentional. Because silence like that, especially from an HOA, isn't accidental. It's strategic. Meanwhile, I'm watching this fence every day like it's some kind of line in the sand that shouldn't exist. And the more I look at it, the more it starts to represent something bigger than just a property dispute. It felt like someone had decided they could take a piece of my land, and I'd just accept it. And here's the thing. I later found out that Greg had been pushing this boundary enclosure project for weeks before I even knew about it, claiming the western lots needed a clean, uniform edge to protect property values. Sounds reasonable on paper, right? Except nobody on our side of the street was ever consulted. Not one of us. No meeting, no notice, no vote. Just execution. And once I realized that, the whole situation shifted in my head. Because this wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. And I was just the guy who happened to be standing where they decided to draw the line. So I gave them time, more than they probably deserved, thinking maybe someone on the board would step in, maybe common sense would kick in, but deep down, I already knew where this was heading. Because people like Greg don't backtrack easily. Not when they've already committed. Not when they think they're right. and definitely not when they think you won't push back. But that assumption, that I'd just let it go, was about to cost them a lot more than 14 inches of dirt. All right, let's pause the story for a second, because what's happening here, it's not just some random neighborhood drama. This is actually a pretty textbook situation once you know what to look for. According to standard procedure, an HOA doesn't just get to wake up one morning and decide to build structures wherever they feel like it, especially something permanent like a fence. There are usually three things that have to happen first: proper notice to homeowners, approval through whatever governance process the HOA follows, and, this is the big one, verification of property boundaries, often through a licensed survey. And here's where it gets interesting. From a legal perspective, property lines are not suggestions. They're legally binding boundaries tied to your deed, your title, and your rights as an owner. If a structure crosses that line, even by a few inches, it's called an encroachment, and it can open the door to liability, forced removal, and reimbursement of damages. It doesn't matter if it was intentional or just sloppy work. The responsibility still falls on whoever authorized it. Now, psychologically, this is where guys like Greg tend to operate in a very predictable pattern. This is a psychological trap. It's called authority bias mixed with escalation commitment. Basically, once someone in a position of power makes a decision, especially publicly, they become emotionally invested in defending it, even when evidence starts stacking against them. Admitting they're wrong doesn't just fix the problem, it threatens their authority. So what do they do instead? They dismiss, delay, and hope the other person backs down. Silence becomes a strategy. Confidence becomes a shield. And in a lot of cases, it works. Because most people don't want the hassle, they don't want legal fees, they don't want conflict with neighbors, so they let it go. But the moment you don't, the entire dynamic changes. So after 3 weeks of being ignored, I stopped asking. I'd given them every reasonable opportunity to fix it quietly, professionally, without turning it into something bigger, and they chose silence, which, in situations like this, is basically a decision in itself. So I hired my own surveyor. Not a friend of a friend, not some quick estimate. A licensed, county-recognized surveyor who came out with the full setup, tripod, instruments, markers, the whole deal. I remember standing there while he worked, watching him take measurements like a surgeon preparing for something precise and irreversible. No opinions, just data. A couple days later, I get the report. Clear as day. That fence wasn't just close to the line. It was 14 inches inside my property, running the entire length of the new section. Not debatable, not interpretive, definitive. And here's the thing. Once you have that kind of documentation, the situation shifts again. It's no longer a disagreement, it's evidence. So I took the next step. I filed the survey with the county, attached a formal notice to the HOA, and laid everything out in plain language. The structure was unpermitted, it was encroaching on private property, and they had 21 days to resolve it voluntarily before I pursued legal remedies. 21 days. That's not arbitrary, by the way. It's enough time to act, but not enough time to stall forever. It's the kind of deadline that says, I'm still being reasonable, but I'm done being patient. And then we waited. Day 1, nothing. Day 7, nothing. Day 14, still nothing. At that point, it almost became surreal. Like they were so committed to ignoring the problem that they convinced themselves it didn't exist. By day 21, I already knew what I was going to do. That deadline wasn't for me. It was for them. So on day 22, I contacted an attorney, filed for a court order authorizing removal of the encroaching structure, and submitted all the documentation, survey, photos, correspondence, the unanswered requests, everything. And here's what people don't always realize. When your case is clean, when the evidence is clear, courts don't drag their feet. They don't need drama. They don't need emotion. They just need proof. And we had it. The order came through faster than I expected. Authorized removal. Plain and simple. No ambiguity, no gray area. The fence had to go. So I scheduled a contractor. Not a demolition crew. Nothing excessive. Just a small team with a compact excavator, the kind you'd use for precise work. Controlled, efficient. I picked a Thursday morning, not for any strategic reason, just the first available slot, but it turned out to be perfect timing. Because as the truck pulled up and the machine rolled off the trailer, I noticed movement 3 houses down. Greg. He steps out of his driveway, arms crossed, already watching. You could tell immediately. He knew. Maybe the HOA got served. Maybe someone finally read the paperwork. Or maybe he just recognized the look of a situation that had gotten away from him. Either way, he didn't come over. He just stood there. So I walked out, gave a quick nod to the crew, showed them the marked line, handed over the order, and that was it. No speech, no confrontation, no theatrics. Just action. The excavator fired up, low rumble filling the street, and the first post came out of the ground with this slow, deliberate pull, dirt cracking, roots snapping, wood shifting like it was finally admitting it didn't belong there. And that moment, that first post lifting free, that's when it became real. Because up until then, this whole thing had been emails, phone calls, paperwork, abstract. Now it was physical, visible, final. The crew worked methodically, one post at a time, no rush, no hesitation. Each section came down clean, like undoing a mistake piece by piece. And Greg, he didn't say a word, didn't step forward, didn't argue, didn't try to stop it. He just stood there, jaw tight, watching every single post come out of the ground, the same ground he was so sure he had the right to claim. 40 minutes. That's all it took. 40 minutes to erase something that had caused weeks of unnecessary tension, all because someone couldn't admit they were wrong. When it was done, the line was clear again. My yard looked like my yard. And the silence, that was the strangest part. No victory speech, no confrontation, just this quiet reset, like the neighborhood itself was exhaling. But the story didn't end there. Because consequences don't stop at removal. The HOA was required, legally, to resurvey the entire western boundary, at their own expense this time, to make sure nothing like this happened again. They had to reapply for permits, reposition the fence correctly, and, this part always makes me smile a little, reimburse me for the costs I incurred. Survey fees, legal fees, just over $6,000, straight out of the association's reserves. And if you've ever lived in an HOA, you know what that really means. It's not just their money, it's everyone's money. Which means Greg's decision didn't just affect me. It cost the entire neighborhood. And that's the part nobody likes to talk about. Because authority feels powerful, right up until it becomes expensive. As for Greg, he still lives 3 houses down. Same routine, same walks, same posture, but there's this unspoken line now, something that didn't exist before. We've passed each other a few times since then. No nod, no acknowledgement, not a single word. And honestly, that silence says more than anything he could have said out loud. So, what do you actually take away from something like this? Because on the surface, it's just a fence, right? 14 inches of dirt, a disagreement, some paperwork, end of story. But if you zoom out a little, this wasn't really about the fence. It was about boundaries, not just the physical kind, but the invisible ones people test every single day. The lesson here is, small violations are rarely about size. They're about permission. When someone crosses a line, literally or figuratively, and nothing happens, that line tends to move. Not all at once, not dramatically, just slowly, quietly, inch by inch. And before you know it, what used to be yours isn't anymore. And that's exactly what this situation was trying to become. Not a construction error, not a miscommunication, but a quiet redefinition of space, backed by confidence and the assumption that I wouldn't push back. Now, here's where most people get stuck, because standing up for yourself sounds good in theory, but in practice, it's uncomfortable. You start asking yourself questions like, is this really worth it? Do I want to deal with lawyers? What if this turns into something bigger? And those questions are valid, but they're also part of the same psychological pressure that keeps situations like this alive. Because the system, whether it's an HOA, a workplace, or even just social dynamics, often relies on the idea that resistance is rare. This is a psychological trap, not just for the person in authority, but for the person being affected. One side believes they can push because they've gotten away with it before. The other side hesitates because conflict feels costly. And right in the middle of that is where decisions get made. Now, I'm not saying every issue needs to escalate to court. It doesn't. In fact, most situations should be resolved earlier if possible. But what matters is that you understand where the line is, both legally and personally, and you're willing to enforce it when necessary. From a legal perspective, what saved me here wasn't aggression, it was documentation. I didn't argue louder, I didn't threaten, I didn't try to outmuscle anyone. I followed a process. Survey, written notice, deadline, legal action. Step by step. Clean. Defensible. And that's important, because when you operate within a clear framework, it removes emotion from the equation. You're not fighting, you're resolving. There's a difference. According to standard procedure, organizations like HOAs function best when there's accountability, transparency, and communication. The moment those things disappear, replaced by assumption, authority, and silence, problems don't just happen, they compound. And that's exactly what happened here. Because think about it, this could have been fixed on day one. A quick conversation, a recheck of measurements, maybe a minor adjustment, done. No cost, no conflict, no story. But instead, it turned into weeks of tension, a legal order, a public removal, and thousands of dollars in expenses, all because someone chose certainty over verification. And that brings me to something I think a lot of people overlook. Being wrong isn't expensive. Refusing to admit you're wrong is. And Greg, whether he realizes it or not, learned that lesson the hard way. Not through a lecture, not through an argument, but through consequences that unfolded slowly, predictably, and very publicly. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, okay, but what would I have done? That's actually the most important question. Would you have waited the full 21 days? Would you have pushed earlier? Would you have tried to negotiate more? Or walked away to avoid the hassle? There's no single correct answer, because every situation has its own context. But what matters is that you're making that decision consciously, not out of pressure, not out of avoidance, and definitely not because someone else assumed you'd stay quiet. Because once you give up that ground, whatever form it takes, it's a lot harder to get it back. And sometimes, it takes a 40-minute lesson with a machine and a court order to remind people where the line actually is. So yeah, 14 inches doesn't sound like much. Until it does.